Every medium has its legendary titles, foundational works that would inform everything going after, cult classics that would influence generations of creators, and popular titles that would stay in cultural consciousness for long after their debut. And many times the creators of these weren't really setting out to make anything that would change the world. They were making what they wanted to make, experimenting with new techniques out of necessity and pushing boundaries by nature of their craft. Sometimes these works might even create new genres without intending to, with labels being invented after the fact to describe them, and the evolution of a genre can result in those classics looking nothing like what we know now if they ever really did fit in the first place. While there's no shortage of examples of all of these things in any medium, there is one set of very important cult classics within the genre of visual novels and edoge, the Denpa Big Three. I've explained what a Denpa is a couple times now on this channel, and to briefly summarize again, it's a genre loosely born out of the Kichikuke and the Denpa-kei subcultures, the former being people interested in the occultic and cruel, and the latter describing a type of delusional conspiracy theorism. Think tinfoil hat stuff and you're on the right track given the word literally means radio waves. From Denpa-kei came Denpa, a term describing stories like the 1993 novel Amelie by Otsuki Kenji, and the visual novel it inspired, 1996's Shizuku by Leaf, tales often dealing with mental illness, cult school, and conspiracy theorism, which then further morphed into something describing some general vibe of characters losing their grasp on reality as the world around them goes mad. Thus, we arrive at the turn of the century, when what Japanese fans of the genre describe as the Big Three Denpa games would be released. 1999, Sui no Sora by Kirokyu, a title that would later be reworked into the far more popular Subarashiki Hibi in 2008. 2001's Shisatsu 101 by Duke, a title I previously looked at that's as unfinished as it is fascinating. And finally, the most well-known and influential, also from 2001, Sayonara Oshiete by Kraftwerk, a title that more people than I can possibly count have requested me to look at. It's also one I've been sort of hesitant to talk about because, to be frank, this game is an endless rabbit hole to discuss. A title loaded to the brim with symbolism, philosophy, religious allegory, meaningful nonsense, and absolute mindfuck moments, a title that can be interpreted countless ways and one that's left a remarkable impact in many subcultures despite its failed launch, and a title that has a complex legacy, both in development history and in how it's affected people now. SayoOshi is one of the few titles developed by Kraftwerk, a studio born out of the ashes of Hardco, a name which longtime viewers may know for creating the Ayoyo-san series of surreal visual novels. After crafting those and some other notable works such as Welcome to the Cinema House, much of the staff went on to work at Peel, creating a few eroge notable for their hardcore content such as Seek, before further branching out into Kraftwerk. Also, there was Stoneheads Co. and Sexty somewhere in that corporate fuckery. That most notably included Nagaoka Kenzo and Sapporo Momoko, the two that I would argue defined Hard as a studio. Together with a revolving door of members, they created the psychological horror title For Release, the torture Nuki Geichigoku Seek, the dating simulator Flowers, and last but not least, SayoOshi, all created with the backing of One Visual Arts. Riding high off the money of their imprint Key's success with Canon, VA was throwing money at just about any creator who wanted it, and so Nagaoka & Co. were given a budget of around 2 to 3 million yen to create their biggest project yet, with the simple plan to make an interesting game. Nagaoka handled the scenario creation, directing, planning, part of the writing, and most of the art responsibilities, with Momoko crafting the soundtrack, other members of Visual Arts assisting in various parts, and Ishino Michiho doing a chunk of the writing, as well as aiding with the scenario. That last person is sort of an outlier on the team because he's not actually an established edoge writer. He's a freelance journalist and writer who ended up with a brief stint in adult games as another writing gig. It's not one he seemed to dislike though. Going off of his interviews in the art book, he was as invested in the project as everybody else. The end result of all of this was a title that felt distinctly out of place in the time it launched. The aforementioned canon just a few years prior solidified the change in the edoge industry from the sort of anything goes mentality in the 80s through to mid-90s towards melodramatic school-themed media mixes, a sight no doubt familiar to modern fans of the genre. SayoOshi's style, which can best be described as falling in the tradition of edogudo nonsense, wasn't exactly what readers were looking for then, with reviewers at the time being at best unfazed by the game and at worst confused and disinterested. And nowhere is the effect of this felt more than the sales numbers, selling a mere 1,000 copies out of 3,000 produced, a 100th of the sales that Canon's successor Air garnered in the prior year. Over time, however, this would change. The small fanbase of people who enjoyed it would grow as the years went on until it became something of a modern phenomena, which lands us squarely back in our current era. Numerous developers of Denpa works now cited as an influence, notably Nyata of Needy Girl Overdose fame, and the fanbase is seriously nothing to scoff at, with a vibrant artwork scene and enough buzz to have successfully gotten the game re-released on DL site at 3,000 yen. A much more affordable price than the over 100k used copies can sell for now. And of course, there's the matter of the game being not just considered one of the big Denpa free, but arguably the biggest one. And I think the reason for that is that it's a far more mature work than the other two. While Tsui no Sora had a lot of room for expansion as demonstrated by Tsubihime managing to turn the 7-hour work into a 50-hour work, and Jisatsu 101 was very obviously not at all ready to be released, SayoOshi is a whole video game with whole themes and whole graphics and whole music. On its face, it's a psychological horror title about a man descending into madness, slowly losing his grip on reality and his control over himself. It's also a game about trauma and the ways in which it can destroy us. It might also be about how terrible otaku are, apparently. Or maybe it's about nothing. Let's just try and break this down and make some sense of it, and maybe gain some insight into why this game is so beloved all these years later. Set in then-contemporary Japan, Sayonara Oshiete has us following the life of Hitomi Hirosuke, a depressed antisocial teacher training at an unnamed all-girls academy being supervised by the strict Takashima Semina. While on the surface he seems to be a normal man, working through his day-to-day life like everyone else, things aren't alright for him. He's haunted every night by visions of an angel being defiled, something of which he attempts to talk about with the school nurse, Tonae Omori, to little success. The dreams continuing and beginning to infiltrate his daily life. Growing increasingly unable to discern reality from delusion, his life begins to crumble, as do his relationships with the students he's intended to care for. The socially awkward librarian Miyuki, the aloof and distant Nozomi, the younger sister Mahiru, the airheaded yet snappy Koyori, and the mysterious Imperial Mutsuki, who resembles the angels of his nightmares. Day by day, the stress of his teaching, his failing mental health, and his cruel, violent delusions all pile on, while the meaning of anything in his life starts to become less clear, if there ever was any at all, and the boundaries between life and death seem to grow dimmer. With nothing else to do but hope his life may soon return to normal, he's left to wander as the world comes crashing down around him. While SayoOshi's story is structured and has a clear beginning and end, the way it gets from one place to another less resembles a traditional plot and more like reading the diary of someone losing their sanity. Events just happen as Hirosuke moves through his repetitive, dull daily life, the only changes being what his conversations are and the odd new delusion that drives him further away from reality. If there's anything that SayoOshi deserves credit for, it's how aware it is of its own premise. A game about a man slowly losing his grasp on reality, growing increasingly depressed and frightened by and with the world and people around him. Once exciting prospects of teaching people he cares for become terrifying as he's unable to manage his health, motions that were once fresh become repetitive, and interactions with people grow more unnerving as anxiety and delusions take over. What sells all of this is the quality of the prose. To say it has one exact style is very much not doing it justice, as its strength comes in both its flexibility and how it evolves with the story. It's about as novellic as a VN can get without straight up being a novel, with short descriptive sentences setting the scene and describing the characters, tinted by Hirosuke's view of the world. While he starts off well enough, albeit with those nightmarish dreams every night, it gets increasingly difficult for him to escape from scornful, cruel, self-aggrandizing, self-hating, often misogynistic thoughts, reflected in how the prose effortlessly changes between the more typical commentary into downright nonsense, which only becomes more pronounced as the story goes on and he slips further into his own mind. The game never feels as if it's becoming lost in all this, though, instead often benefiting from how varied the narration can be, even going as far as to play with quirks of the visual novel medium. Screens of text that play without any action from the player, varying text speeds to convey emphasis and impact, blocks that are disgustingly long and exhausting to read, clever uses of screen clearing, and synergy of audio and other visual elements all makes for shockingly immersive and well thought through presentation that beats even many more modern visual novels I've played, adding a lot to the horror aspects of the title. I wouldn't say this game has any real scares per se, it never tries to make you jump out of your seat or shit bricks, but what it does have is an overwhelmingly oppressive atmosphere that makes the surreal sequences as terrifying to read as they are engrossing, urging you to keep clicking even while your gut tells you to turn away, all before cutting off when you're most unnerved and just as confused as Hitomi is. SayoOshi's writing is very much a throw everything out and see what sticks kind of thing, with a million various elements all congealing into a single work of art that invites you to simply vibe with it. Classic literature, philosophy, religious symbolism, and undefined boundaries between what's real and meaningful and what's fake and delusional encourages you to think as deeply as you please, but never allows you to ruminate on a single subject or train of thought for so long that it can consume and overwhelm you, nor so quickly that you can forget it. While there are many moments of pure spectacle, there's just as many moments of meaningful nothingness, where what little plot exists comes to a standstill for long stretches of internal monologuing or bizarreness to occur, Hitomi often becoming stuck in his own thoughts, ranging from frustration over having to journal his day at the school for Semina, to writing monster and angel over and over again on a blackboard. With the sheer amount thrown at you and how uncertain the meaning of much of it is, it's totally up to the reader to decide what does and doesn't have purpose beyond shock and awe. I certainly have my own thoughts on it all, but suffice to say this work can be as dense or hollow as you will it to be, as some people simply play it and enjoy the vibes on offer, while others perform Lacanian psychoanalysis. Regardless of how deep you're wanting to go, I can at least guarantee that your first playthrough of the game will not be boring. I had a blast taking notes, reading deep in the themes, getting lost in the prose, attempting to analyze it, and watching the story progress and characters become more and more nuanced. Not necessarily growing, just gaining a microcosm of new nuance. Each of them tends to reside in one specific place, tying into the mechanics of the game that I'll get into shortly. On the rooftops, there's Nozomi, a depressed and hopeless girl who wishes to fly but cannot, instead spending her days being wistful over her perceived uselessness. Despite this, she keeps a friendly appearance up, welcoming Hitomi's company and even leaving him a note when she decides to take a break from her usual spot for a day. In the Kyudo Club, he meets Koyori, an empty-headed doll-like girl who's capable of some surprisingly sharp remarks, often touching on Hitomi's sore points, though he still finds her interesting to be around and even learns some things about the sports from her, taking time to blow off some steam by firing a couple of shots. In the courtyard, he meets with Mahiru, a young girl who's always chipper, always wanting to play and insistent on calling Hitomi big brother, even if he doesn't immediately recall having a younger sister. She's cute and peppy like a kitten, fond of times where she's praised and gets to do what she wants, and less fond of times when Hitomi teases her. In the library, he meets Miyuki, the bookworm who's almost always reading and has a near encyclopedic knowledge of literature, compensating for her struggles with interacting with people, especially men. She never particularly breaks out of her shell of Hitomi, but the two do manage to spend some time discussing literature and philosophy, her always having an answer ready at the helm to anything Hitomi might be wondering. And then there's Mutsuki, the angelic girl. Shy yet warm, caring yet distant, she appears to Hitomi as an almost pure and perfect figure, her mere presence causing him to question his sanity and what his fantasies of violating an angel who looks like her may mean. Nevertheless, the two find themselves drawn to each other, almost like kindred spirits. And that's basically all you get on the heroines. Sure, there's a little bit I haven't said for the sake of spoilers, but it's nothing that makes them any deeper, and no one really has any serious goals or motivations, no one really deals with their problems, all of the characters just sort of exist and serve more to highlight aspects of Hitomi's being than anything else. For example, it's through Best Girl Koyori that we're able to learn more about Hitomi's anxieties about himself, his inferiority complex, and his more violent impulses to hurt others, but none of that reflects on her in the slightest, other than learning she doesn't like having her limbs detached, I guess. This isn't to say that she's not always entertaining, but it's hard to be invested in these characters in the same way you could be invested in the heroines of other games. Maybe to some extent this is intentional, but the end result is that it's hard to see these characters as anything more than thematic vessels and collections of traits. The only reason I don't want to call it outright bad writing is because there is arguably a purpose to this, as I'll get into with spoilers, and because what few aspects each character has are very strongly written. Mutsuki, for instance, might only be an angelic pure figure, but the way in which her and Hitomi interact is very compelling, with their discussions taking a far more metaphorical and philosophical slant than the other characters. Well, besides Miyuki, but her whole gimmick as a socially awkward bookworm is info-dumping about old books and philosophy. If I had to pick a least favorite of the 5 heroines, it would probably be Mahiru, the Imoto archetype. Everything involving her besides the almost comedically fucked up parts of her plot just bounced right off of me. She's still interesting in the moment-to-moment and has some great interactions with Hitomi, but to me is not nearly as interesting as the others, and her story variation feels like it reveals very little new about her. And to be fair though, that's as much a problem with the poor handling of the game's structure as it is with the writing. SayoOshi is much more akin to a choose-your-own-adventure book or a Twine story as opposed to a route-based visual novel a la Clannad or Fate Stay Night. A single run is broken up into 11 days, with 9 of those opening and closing with conversations with the nurse and supervisor respectively. In between that, you're allowed to roam around the school freely and visit the locations the students hang around, with the day ending after a certain amount explored. Each time you go to a place, you progress the plot of the associated character there a little more. Any choices you make outside of where to go are mostly meaningless though. The one that does matter is the ending choice on day 9, where choosing a character you haven't made enough progress with will result in their bad end playing out, and making a valid selection will result in the last 2 days playing out differently. On paper, I don't think this is a terrible idea. I took a look at Fushigi Densha a couple months ago on my channel, which is a game that applies the similar scene variation idea to a looping story. You start a run, make a ton of choices, and then do another to see more variations, which worked fantastic there due to the shockingly high amount of content and the short length of the loop. In SayoOshi though, there is there's just not enough content to go around. Finishing the game one time lets you see, I'd say 75% of what's here, with each subsequent run having less and less new to it as you exhaust the library of scenes. Made even worse by this game not having a stop skip on unread text option, nor any option to show red text as a different color. I think what Kraftwerk was going for here was to harken back to the days gone of ADV games where experimental structure like this was common, but I also have to seriously wonder how this was intended to be experienced. Were you only meant to play this game once or twice or until you were satisfied? Were you meant to space out your playthroughs over a long period with the route variations serving as ways to keep things fresh? Or was it just flat out bad design from the get-go that had one step in the present and one in the past? It's hard to say, especially because Nagaoka's only response to this subject is, sorry it was repetitive, but all I know is that trying to 100% this game in one go is utterly exhausting despite the short length. I managed to clear my first run of Mutsuki with my upper intermediate 1 1/3 years of studying Japanese in 10 hours playtime, with the other 4 taking 5 or so to read overall, yet those 5 hours feel like they dragged on forever because of the repetition, and this was with regular breaks as needed to collect myself from some of the more challenging content. One of the things this game is infamous for is this trigger warning on the back of the box, warning you not to play it if you're severely depressed, which might sound like a bit of an exaggeration, but I think it's well warranted. Even beyond the subject matters of mental illness, misogyny, trauma, and so on, there's a lot of visceral artwork here, both in terms of sexual violence and gore. I'm not going to list off everything that's in this game, partly because I don't need to and because YouTube will kill me, but if you're sensitive to anything I just mentioned, then I would advise heeding a ton of caution with this game, because it gets rough. As in, multiple detailed CGs of characters' bloodied corpses after taking their own lives or being murdered rough. What makes all of this work in a thematic sense in the context of the story is that none of it feels any more tantalizing than you yourself would make it out to be. The scenes of characters dying are unnerving and unsettling. The moments of realistic assault are only eroticized in as much as Hitomi does so in his mind, and almost all of the darker moments have payoffs that utilize Hitomi's inability to discern reality and fantasy in impressive ways. It also helps that not all of these moments have artwork. Sometimes all you get is prose, and a great example of telling but not showing. I could mostly handle going into this game blind, but that's not for everyone, which is why I spent the last while talking in some vague terms about what might be triggering to some. I feel it's better to give some warnings about what to expect as opposed to throwing people to the wolves, even if those wolves are immensely fascinating, because this game is a thrill ride from beginning to end, one that encourages you to play along with the absurdity. I also don't want to imply that this game is impossible to stomach, because the tact used here feels at least a notch better than, say, how some of the old canon Rants games handle sexual violence, or how many modern ultra-violent games deal with their gore. I found this game, at the absolute worst, very rare occasion, to be upsetting enough to require a short break, but it didn't get anywhere near causing a panic attack or something. Obviously, trauma responses are personal, but I figured I'd give my 2 cents as someone with a difficult history and a PTSD diagnosis. And to detox a little bit from that, this game does also have some consensual and normal content in it, particularly with Mutsuki. Much like the rest of the game though, it doesn't really come off as hot, which I'd consider a positive. The sexual content that isn't erotic is something I find really interesting in stories, and it's represented well here. At least when the scenes aren't boring. Say what you will about how extreme this game can be, and there's a lot to be said, but I do think it really excels narratively when it delves into more difficult subject matters or extreme kink, like BDSM exhibitionism and doll joint gudo. As mentioned before, the architect behind all the artwork here is Nagaoka, who took on a majority of the illustrative duties. The only part that was outsourced was some of the coloring, which was touched up by him and then shaded in his distinct aggressive style, first seen in the final 2 Ayoyo-san games over half a year prior. It's honestly impossible to understate just how gorgeous not this shading looks, but the sense of color in general, particularly in how the world is dyed a strong, permanent sunset orange. As if the prose itself wasn't ethereal enough, describing the world and thoughts in a way that feels realistic yet ever so slightly detached, that one artistic decision makes the entire game completely unlike anything else, and it makes the few CGs that lack this dye striking, especially as many of those are the most unnerving or downright otherworldly in the title. This is without even saying that Nagaoka's style is just frankly timeless. If it weren't for the low 640 by 480 resolution the game runs at, and by extension the low resolution the standing sprites and backgrounds are stored at, this game could very easily pass for a smaller title released now. Much as I love the moe blobby designs of Canon and the scrunkly jank of many titles that came out of the early Windows 95 era of eroge, SayoOshi is just so absurdly fucking refined that it's impossible to compete. The aforementioned shading and coloring, the subtle facial expressions, the detailing of the characters, the style that feels caught between the mid-90s and early 2000s, the way the sprites clash beautifully with the delicately rendered 3D backgrounds, it's an utterly gorgeous game that stands among the best of the time, like Kao no Naitsuki and Utowareru Mono. I also want to draw attention to the character designs because Nagaoka nailed them all. Everyone looks visually distinct but cohesive with a single overall aesthetic, always having a sense of darkness and ethereality while being down to earth and realistic. As normal for the time though, Hitomi has pretty much no design to speak of. There's nearly nothing shown of this man in the game, or hell even the art book, with the most we ever get being a peek at the side of his face and some hair. Aside from that, most of his time is spent cloaked in the shadows or just outright left out of CGs for the sake of player immersion, something I've never been fond of in games with a strong defined POV character. However, this all changed in May 2018 when Nagaoka suddenly posted the following to Twitter, revealing that Hitomi is, in fact, a hot ikemen, and a lot of women, including myself, have been losing their shit over him ever since. Like, seriously, look at this man, he's fucking hot! Something else I want to draw attention to is a little CG collection that Nagaoka worked on that sort of bridges the gap between his more grounded Windows era art like this and For Release, and his more over-the-top stuff on the PC98 with Ayayo, Hard Special Collection, a disc that pretty much no one seems to talk about in English communities. Some people see the gallery Mushi no Onna on this disc as a prototype of SayoOshi's art, and I think that's very well warranted. The coloring more resembles the dark, moody, muted yet vibrant tones of the game, the character designs are far more grounded than what was seen in Ayayo, and the composition of the art much resembles what you'd see here. This disc is seriously still worth peering at today, if not exclusively for this gallery. It's got all the aesthetic charm of SayoOshi with the added appeal of that famous 16-color PC98 look that smooths out the imperfections of any art. The only thing it's really missing to fully set the mood is music, arguably one of the most famous parts of this game. By the point SayoOshi had released, Sapporo Momoko had established herself as a musician willing to experiment and craft tunes unlike anything else, such as with For Release's techno and industrial take on Beethoven's piece of the same name, and Jigoku 6's BGM that ranges from hard rock and ambient horror to jazz and classical, and SayoOshi is no exception to this. I think it's here, more than any previous title of hers, that you can feel how varied her expertise in compositional styles is, and how well she's able to mix and match them. The soundtrack makes extensive use of acoustic instruments in ways both typical and unorthodox, mixed of a wide variety of more electronic sounds. Especially in the drums, 808s and snappy electronic hits are all over the score. This is all put to good effect in compositions that run a whole gamut of styles, some of which are character themes and others of which are generic BGM. Some like L'Ange et Contudur are suitably ethereal and entrancing, while others like Secret de Folie sound like the score to an adrenaline-filled panic attack, and yet others like Soleil de Alvois invoke quiet contemplation. I couldn't find any information on what might have influenced Sapporo during the making of this game. All that's really noted in the art book is that people in the Kraftwerk offices were blasting the music of Otsuki Kenji's band Kiniku Shoujo Tai, which doesn't really say a whole ton because everybody was listening to them in the 80s and 90s. The same goes for Togawa Jun, an amazingly diverse artist and the source of the name of the game, with Sayonara Oshiete being one of her big hits. If I could pin any singular inspiration though, it's probably her, especially of songs like Tamahime-sama and Toyama Sho Gakokota, which, also a fun fact about Jun, that gallery I mentioned a moment ago is named after her song Mushi no Onna, making it one of 3 eroge named after her music alongside Ski Ski Daisuki, a very early yandere eroge. Really, this vagueness about what inspired SayoOshi and what culture it was meant to fit into, per se, makes the legacy it's had curious to me. Nagaoka said in an interview for the Tsubihebe 10th anniversary book that he nor the other writers of the Denpa Big Three consider their games to be Denpa at all. Nagaoka in particular seemed to be very detached from a lot of the origins of the genre as we know it now, having never played Shizuku and making no mention of reading Amelie Day within the art book. Instead, he described the game in later interviews as being influenced by the era of eroguro nonsense, art and music and literature that fittingly was nonsensically erotic and grotesque, initially parodying the modernism and politics of early 1900s Japan and changing with the times. To quote a paper by Doctor of Philosophy Lisa Lackney on the subject, as a whole, the movement used extreme representations to reveal the extreme state of modern life. As one critic explained at the time, from the point of view of the present state of affairs, people call it ultra, and the form of that ultra itself is typically modern. Eroguro nonsensu, often shortened to eroguro or simply one of its components, embraced the ultra characteristic of modern life. If you want a good example of how utterly batshit and near comprehensible these works could be, one could turn to some of the work of Edogudo nonsense pioneer Edogawa Rampo, such as the story where a man stows himself inside of a chair and hopes a beautiful woman will sit on him. One could also turn to the contents in any given issue of the Garo magazine, which range from fear dreamlike comics to straight up lesbian erotica. But I guess whether or not the writers, or I as a young 20-something wannabe critic, feel this game is Denpa or not has no bearing on the culture. People strongly believe this game to be Denpa. It certainly had an influence on the genre and culture, and so that's how it's going to be remembered from now on. This is just important to note because to me, the game feels very different in terms of tone and writing from other Denpa works I've experienced, which also includes how it wraps up. In any discussion of SayoOshi, the big elephant in the room has to be addressed. For as much as I've praised this game where I think it really deserves it and given criticism that's warranted but not experience ruining, the ending to this game does so much to spoil the whole that it's downright frustrating. And I'm normally someone who can write off a bad ending as not affecting the rest of the work, but this is rough. Before I get into all that very heavy discussion though, I would like to take a moment to shout out my patrons who make videos like these possible. Well everyone, it's that time again for life updates, cool shoutouts, Q&As, and other things, and I'm gonna cut to the chase here. We have hit 1,000 USD per month. I seriously cannot express my gratitude for being able to make it this far. Thank you all so fucking much. I was genuinely about to start crying when I woke up a few days ago and saw that Patreon had hit the 4-figure mark right on the dot. It could not have been more perfect, and I seriously can't be happier. When I started this channel out about a year and a half ago, I could not have expected it for it to grow so fast and so steadily, with the occasional big bump like the Eyepatch Wolf shoutout, the Possessioner video, and most recently the Freedio video, which has somehow hit over 40k views in just a month, which I'm also super grateful for. I'm really happy that everybody seems to love that video. It was a huge passion project for me because I love obscure game consoles, I love talking about them, I love Japanese media, and I'm happy I got to combine that into something that everybody wanted to watch. So, to everyone who's donated, watched these videos, commented kind things, liked them, shared them around, and all that other good stuff, and also especially to those who assisted with research and helping these videos come to fruition, I gotta give a huge shout out to Castell for always being a massive help throughout this whole time, and even in this video they were a huge help with a lot of the research for this video. Just everyone who's made this possible, thank you so much for allowing me to have a career I love and live a stable life. There is something special about hitting that milestone and moving into the 1K mark that feels impossibly accomplishing, and I'm grateful to everyone who's made that possible and everyone who's supported me. To give back a little bit, like always, I'd like to shout out some channels that I've been enjoying that deserve your love and attention. I got by via luck that allowed me to reach the amazing audience I have now and for that to continue growing naturally, and I'd like to try and spread that luck around a little bit if at all possible. The first channel I want to shout out is FTB, who does retrospective histories of Japanese PC games, though seemingly much more focused on titles without adult erotic content. His latest video at the time of writing this is a documentary on Soft Studio Wing, a developer group who I'd been only vaguely familiar with because of their game Mirrors until watching this video, and it definitely got me interested in their works. His style reminds me a lot of something like a PBS documentary, with simple presentation, calm commentary with a little bit of humor here and there, and a manner of writing that manages to make any chosen topic engrossing. If you want to learn more about Japanese PC gaming, then I'd definitely suggest looking into his videos. They're a wonderful chill time. The second channel is PopArena, specifically his Nickelodeon history documentary series, Knickknacks. It is by far my favorite video series on YouTube, an expansive look at a channel that's relevant to an immense amount of television history, all covered proficiently and entertainingly. Each episode is an incredibly comprehensive look at the show in question, oftentimes covering things you probably wouldn't have even expected to air on the channel, like old anime dubs, old documentaries, and 50s sitcoms, interwoven with the history of Nickelodeon. It's just so engrossing to watch. Like, I've found myself completely sucked into subjects that I thought I could never possibly care about, like old game shows and some of the aforementioned stuff. Like, I was hooked on the episodes about the sitcoms. It's incredible. I seriously cannot recommend it enough. If you have any interest in television history, any interest in the history of kids media, or any interest in animation, then you owe it to yourself to watch this series. It's so good. With those channels hopefully now on your watch later list and going to be checked out very soon, I do have 2 more cool things to talk about. First, I'm going to be at ColossalCon in Ohio this year. Not hosting a panel or anything, I'm way too awkward for that. I'm just going to be out and about with friends, probably buying any Blue Archive stuff that artists have for sale. And like I said, I am kind of socially awkward, but if you haven't seen me, feel free to say hi briefly. I mostly intend to keep to myself, but I think it would be pretty cool to see fans and maybe take some selfies. Who knows? And the last cool thing is a little sneak peek at next month's video. Since people seem to enjoy voting on whether I'd cover this game or the 3DO first, and the 3DO won out, but hey, here we are, SayoOshi video, which I guess kind of fits for, you know, this is one of the most requested games I've had, and it's the 1K money special. It works out. I figured I'd run another poll to determine what to cover for May. A freeway between Yami no Kore 2, Yorogakuru, and Pia Carrot 2, with YNK 2 winning with surprising ease. While I don't intend to run polls like this for every video, it was pretty fun to see what people wanted to watch, and I'm excited to have an excuse to revisit the world of Black Psych again. And if you want to vote in polls like that, support these videos, and see them without censors, then consider chipping in a little bit a month on Patreon if you're in a position to do so. You'll get all those things, plus monthly channel updates and script previews, with no minimum needed. Whatever is the minimum that Patreon allows you to donate in your currency, that's all you need to give. And if you'd like to leave a one-time donation instead, then I have a Ko-fi account as well. But as always, there's no pressure to do any of those things. All forms of support matter, and I appreciate it all, from the donations, to commenting, to sharing, to watching, to like, it all means a ton to me and all contributes to being able to do this. I'm just happy knowing people enjoy these silly little videos. Y'all are, as always, goddamn amazing. So again, thank you so much for your continued support, thank you so much for getting me to this big milestone, and I'm excited to keep on keeping on like this as long as you are all willing to watch. And on that note, let's return to the show. While SayoOshi's structure makes it defy any sort of easy summary, given that little actually happens in the story, I'm gonna try and explain a basic outline of the plot so there's at least some basis for me to build my criticism off of. I'm also gonna be basing this off of Mitsuki's variation where relevant, since it is, for all intents and purposes, the true ending of the game. At the beginning of the scenario, you're thrust straight in with very little preamble. Your first sight is one of Hitomi's nightmares of a mysterious angel being devoured by some massive tentacles, uncertain what to make of any of it. After waking up and performing his duties at school, he consults Dr. Tonae about what he sees, attempting to seek some sort of answers, although none come. Their discussion is interrupted by the arrival of Mitsuki, leading Hitomi to leave the room after some brief embarrassment. Following some thinking on his own for a bit in the restroom and exploring some parts of the school to meet with students, he calls it a day, begrudgingly logging a report of his activities for his supervisor. One brief scuffle later and he's off to rest, only to see that same vision again. Every day plays out with this same dull routine. Wake up, talk to the doctor, think, talk to the students, clock in, and go back. Though with each day, things become slightly more broken. Tonae's consultations continue to prove useless, Semina's strictness becomes exhausting, and his professional relationship with each of the students degrades as he learns more about them and their quirks. In a short time, reality and surreality begin blending together, with Mitsuki being of particular note for her resemblance to the angel of his nightmares. While initially something Hitomi tries to write off, the gravity of the situation becomes clear to him when Mahiru describes the 7 mysteries of the school to him, one belonging to each major location, including a tree in the forest where an angel was once said to reside before she was devoured. This is the event that sets Hitomi off completely, and from here his delusions become more severe and his thoughts more engrossed in self-hate and trauma. His fantasies of assaulting and killing the women of the school become impossible to ignore, intrusive thoughts about his inferiority complex and fear of the world become stronger, and the stress of his training becomes so severe that he begins to wonder if he'll ever return to normal after it's over. By the last 3 days, he's completely crumbled as a person and become unable to discern reality from fiction, plagued by visions of an angel that desires him for reasons he can't know, believing now the only thing he can do in his otherwise meaningless and hopeless life is to save the one he desires the most. With the player's route choices throughout the game and the choice here affecting the ending, although the fate of the girls is always tragic. Mahiru runs off into the bushes like a cat and dies after being hurt by Hitomi, reminding him of the death of a cat in his childhood. Nozomi dies attempting to fly off the rooftops like a bird with a broken wing, shortly after being reborn like hatching from an egg, away, yet still cannot fly and dies again trying. Coyote is killed by Hitomi, firing arrow after arrow at her like she's a practice doll. Miyuki is brutally chopped up, her organs separated from her body in an attempt to preserve her. Most crucially, her brain now sealed by a window for all of time. In all of these endings, Mutsuki tells Hitomi that she wishes they could meet again, and perhaps that time they could be together. And so, if the player does go with her, he, at the end of the day, finds her in the form of an angel, hanging from the tree as she waits for it to grow tall to the heavens. No matter the choices made, the day always ends the same, with Hitomi attempting to go back. But not home, not anywhere, because there is nowhere for him to return to, only an empty void. A meaningless, derelict space of nothing, unfit for a man who despises the meaningless. After the screen phase, we're treated to a scene that's distinctly different in tone from the rest of the game. A conversation between Tonae and Semina, who discuss the prospects of a patient's well-being. That patient being Hitomi, Semina's gynophobic younger brother suffering from severe psychotic depression who's been under the watch of Tonae. While being cared for by her, he's taken a keen liking to some things around the school. An injured bird on the rooftop who cannot fly, a stray cat who hangs around the courtyard, a doll in the Kyudo club, and so on, occasionally acting out in violent rage and causing harm. But otherwise wandering aimlessly, without purpose, lost in his own uncertain thoughts. However, there is hope for recovery. He's taken a particular liking to a woman who was recently discharged from the hospital after being in for severe depression. Mutsuki, whom he acts kindly towards, her almost being a tethering point to reality for him. With her around, there seems to be some hope of recovery. And so, Semina thanks Tonae for taking care of Hitomi and walks out, ending Sayonara o Oshiete. That final sequence is infamous among people who've played the game. A lot of Japanese user reviews are critical of it, and there's a really good reason for that. It commits the fatal sins of attempting to explain something that not only doesn't need a concrete explanation or reason, but explains it in such a way that it fundamentally alters how you perceive the entire work in a terrible way. All of the symbolism, all of the surreality, all of the mindfuck moments, and all of the metaphor that's hiding within the meaningful nonsense and potential delusions doesn't really matter, because it's all canonically nothing but fabrications by a man suffering from psychosis, making characters of his desires people from his past traumas he experienced, and placing them onto inhuman objects. The ending also really calls into question just what the hell Hitomi was doing throughout the game. If Mahiru is just a cat, if Miyuki is just a brain in a jar, if Coyote is just a doll, if Nozomi is just a bird, then does that mean this man copulated with a cat, shagged a brain in a jar, got down with an anatomical doll, and whacked off with a fucking hurt crow? For that matter, how much of what happened with Mutsuki is actually real and actually matters? How many of his discussions with Semina were real? And furthermore, doesn't this make Tonae the worst fucking doctor in existence? Not only is she of no help to him, but she outright plays into his delusions, most infamously of the scene where she describes the Mario games as if they're real to him, serving as a major impetus for him to begin believing he needs to save someone, and he's the only one who can do it. She also possibly has sex with him, which despite thousands of hours of anime saying otherwise, I do not think is acceptable medical protocol. This ending also implies some very uncomfortable takes on people with mental illnesses that are seen as dangerous or scary, and by that I mean it reinforces the idea that they're dangerous and scary and people suffering from delusions are unfit for society. Hitomi seems to be institutionalized from the start of the game merely for being unwell and abnormal, despite the fact that he's not hurting anyone. And the reasoning for doing this is only reinforced by Tonae being abusive and actively feeding his delusions until he becomes genuinely capable of harm. The bad endings even go as far as him being thrown into a padded cell because of an outburst. And then there's the angle of object fetishization this implies. As just mentioned, most of the characters here aren't real people, they're just things that Hitomi found himself obsessed with, things that he humanized and anthropomorphized based on his life experiences. As the game goes on, he starts becoming more delusional and misogynistic with these objects he anthropomorphizes as pretty girls, beating them, assaulting them, even breaking them. I don't think it's a stretch to say this idea of anthropomorphization is in some way related to similar otaku trends of the time and even now, and it's also reminiscent of cultural concepts bouncing around at the time of otaku being misogynists who prefer these collections of traits to real girls, seeking comfort in delusions in art. Some academics in the audience might be thinking this concept sounds familiar, and that's because it's exactly the subject of Hiroki Ozuma's highly influential 2001 book, Database Animals, which explores the relationship between modern capitalism and otakus, people who love to consume information for the sake of it, constructing their own narratives out of media to compensate for the lack of a grander narrative in the world following the end of the Cold War. Wow, that sure is a lot of words, so just what was our boy cooking? Well, the book is busy presenting the extremely obvious thesis of people like consuming things in the most painful way possible via a mixture of misunderstood philosophy and lack of knowledge about otaku culture. It also makes such grand claims as multi-root systems in games being a sign of otaku suffering from multiple personality disorders, porting games being postmodernist, and infographics like this. This man should not be in the kitchen. If it's not already clear, I think this book is absolutely and utterly atrocious, but there are reasons I bring it up here, because it shows these exact ideas about otaku were so pervasive as to be codified in academia, and because it effectively mirrors all of the concerns that this ending implies about Hitomi. He is a deeply damaged person who resents the emptiness of his life, and progressively begins believing in narratives that he's constructed around objects created from the database of his life. These objects happen to be women, or really abstractions of them that fill some specific niche for him, eventually becoming subjects of his worsening misogynistic and violent tendencies. To quote Azuma summarizing and agreeing with a terrible take by psychiatrist Saito Tamiki, the girl images consumed in otaku culture basically have nothing to do with real women but are projections of the otaku's own obsession with his own phallus, i.e. a fetish object created by the projection of narcissism. Hitomi is essentially the worst case example of Azuma's database animal, the worst case of the otaku stereotype and what many otaku feared they were following the high-profile media case of the otaku murderer in the late 80s. A mentally ill man who becomes so obsessed with objects that he begins to fall in love with them and assign feelings, desires, wants, and hopes to them. A man who constructs fantasies and realities so dangerous that he needs to be locked in one place for the rest of his life in hopes that he might eventually recover, lest he be let out into society and hurt everyone else. Despite the fact the game clearly establishes the significant amount of untreated trauma and his abuse at the hands of his doctors, making everything worse. One could possibly make the argument that this game is actually being critical of this, because after all, it spends quite a lot of time delving into why Hitomi's trauma formed him into the person he is now, and the ending makes apparent that Tonae had been performing some serious medical malpractice. But neither of those actually counters the narrative of mental illness gross. The ending is wholly focused on dialogue between two people who treat this matter seriously and earnestly believe that Hitomi needs to be institutionalized due to his harmful acts that he committed in his childhood and his mental illness now. Most crucially, Hitomi is given absolutely no voice here. There's no monologuing prose, he's given no chances to counter this narrative, he's just around, with two neurotypical people explaining why he's unfit for society because he was a stupid, cruel-abused kid and now a deeply traumatized adult who's acting out. So what does this all mean? Is SayoOshi just some game about how otaku are all mentally ill misogynists, or is it a deep exploration of trauma? Is it an ableist mess, or is it an exploration of our darkest feelings and fears? And the answer is, I really don't know, and I'm not sure how deeply the writers thought about it either. Nagaoka and Ishino have admitted they didn't think at all about what was real in the game and what wasn't. The whole thing was essentially made on vibes, man. The core philosophy being to make something interesting. I feel this is important to note because for all the crap that ending implies, for how much it hurts the rest of the game when taken at face value, I really don't know if there was any intention greater from the authors than to shock the player. Does that mean it can be ignored when analyzing the game, or that it's wrong to feel like it betrays the entire experience? Not really. I still think it's a pretty miserable addition to the title that answers all of the wrong things and brings up tons of new, horrible questions. But knowing Nagaoka's background and his interest in Edogudo nonsense, I don't think it's wrong to conjecture that he and Ishino were just throwing whatever they could at the wall to make something interesting, and this happened to be one huge dud in a vast sea of concepts. Because truthfully, SayoOshi is a fascinating game, ending aside, and what I think it nails more than anything is the idea that no one is truly pure in thought. Hitomi is a deeply, deeply unhappy person because of the life he's been forced to live. An exhausting 9-to-5 job that does nothing to fulfill him, returning home every night to absolutely nothing and coming back to the same hell, with no time left to reconcile his own pains. It leads to him struggling to perform, and it worsens his mental health in a never-ending cycle that he can't escape because, well, he has to work to live, despite not being fit to perform the labor he's forced to. It's because of this that he starts seeking catharsis in his darkest thoughts and eventually acting out on them, unable to find any other release for his suffering. While reading the game, it's pretty easy to see the worst results of this, the violence, the assault, and so on, and go, oh man, that's fucked up, without thinking much about it because, Well, frankly, a lot of what happens in this game is fucked up. The Edo scenes in particular, as I mentioned before, are goddamn horrifying. His pure rushes of adrenaline from doing terrible things, from giving into the most unwelcome thoughts in his mind, is disturbing to read. But, and here's the thing, nothing that Hitomi thinks or feels is, at its core, unique to him. It's clear from the start of the game that he's more than capable of being a completely functioning person when not under severe stress. Sure, he's got some delusions and struggles to communicate with people, but that doesn't make him innately threatening or incapable of existence. It's only through the aforementioned never-ending grind of work, life, and being forced to engage in things he has no desire to engage with that he begins falling apart and violently acting out on fantasies that he's scared of having. Fantasies that completely average, normal people are capable of having too. After all, how many people think about acting violently towards others who have wronged or hurt them? Or better yet, how many people who seem perfect and well-adjusted play violent games specifically to experience a form of catharsis from indulging in the kinds of brutality that Hitomi does, but from a safe distance? What SayoOshi's most extreme content does is shorten that distance. It puts you in the second-person perspective and forces you, the player going along with and partaking in these fantasies, to confront that everyone is capable of having those dark thoughts. It is the violence and spectacle of cruel art with little of the cathartic release to hide the brutality. The game-like satisfaction intended to be gotten from killing in a title like Grand Theft Auto and defiling in a title like some of Illusion's more extreme games is gone, replaced instead with prose that relishes in the horror of it all before catapulting the reader back to reality, now made to identify with Hitomi's own anxiety over what these thoughts mean about him. Denying that anyone is capable of fantasizing about or wishing for terrible things is to deny the fact that human brains suck and think of terrible things, especially when we're confronted with overwhelming emotions and traumas we don't know how to handle. And to be ableist and say that violent thought is specifically a neurodivergent thing rather than it being human nature to crumble under stress helps no one. It only makes it harder for those who need help to speak out and realize that the systems that make the lives of the most vulnerable worse affect everybody. I don't think this is at all an unagreeable take on the game's themes and text, but what I believe makes SayoOshi interesting is that the title, as a whole, refuses to present any sort of positive resolution to this problem. Compare it to something like Gore Screaming Show, another game that I recently reviewed that deals with equally dark topics of trauma and catharsis through destruction. That story ultimately ends with an uplifting, if melancholic, message that makes it feel like one can move past these things, that they can come back from a path of devastation and depression. SayoOshi doesn't have that. There's nothing in this game that builds up into something even vaguely positive besides the part of the ending that says Mitsuki offers a chance of hope. Hitomi's life just keeps getting worse and worse until he ultimately shatters and finds himself unable to escape from his traumas, his visions, and his pains, seemingly repeating for all eternity. Actually, a motif I don't think people discuss nearly enough is repetition, something that hides in plain sight everywhere. Nozomi's ending is the most blatant example of the entire thing about her dying and being reborn into something supposedly better, only to find she's flawed in the same way. There's the title of the game itself, Teach Me to Say Goodbye, and the setting of the game, a never-ending twilight as so eloquently put by the ending theme. Even individual scenes play with this idea, with some of the most memorable moments being Hitomi living out a scene over and over and over again, moments that felt highly resonant to my own experiences with PTSD and traumatic memories. Part of me genuinely wonders, especially given the post-credit scene of Hitomi experiencing a new delusion after supposedly recovering, if this game was initially intended to have a looping structure. With all that said though, I don't exactly know how I feel about this kind of pessimism. On one hand, I feel there is something compelling about SayoOshi's delivery that made playing it feel less like I was wallowing in my own angst over the more challenging parts of my life, and more that I was being heard. Very few people live a perfect life, and some of those that do look down upon the less fortunate, flaunting it and saying things could be so great if you just tried and stopped being so negative, which in turn makes it feel like you shouldn't be allowed to be negative or depressed or spiteful, and merely having those emotions makes you a terrible person. In that regard, I think there is value in something being so unabashedly depressive with no greater justification, because everyone has feelings and thoughts they'd rather not have, thoughts they need to recognize, work through, heal from, and not be shamed for, lest we be stuck in a loop of misery forever like Hitomi is. But at the same time, that's pretty brutal, and like I said, none of the positive messaging that I gave is actually in the game. The ending pretty much says the opposite, in fact, and implies the only way that Hitomi, this terrible, ill, violent man, can ever be fixed is by the virtue of some beautiful fallen angel who's recovered from her own suffering. Besides that, dude's just gotta wallow in misery for his whole life, with all the structures that make him miserable, capitalism, society, ableism, going uninterrogated. I do completely understand this game isn't about these things. Sayonara Oshiete was never meant to be a deep exploration of what it means to be neurodivergent in an ableist society. It's meant to be captivating nonsense about a man slowly losing all control over his life. It's something where occasional resonant moments stay in your memory and resurface like scattered childhood dreams. But like with any work, it's hard for me not to think about what all this text means in the greater scheme of things and how it all connects. And in my mind, SayoOshi is as thematically interesting and reflective as it is vapid and pessimistic. This is only one reading of the game though. You can take the text and subtext countless different directions just through how much of it there is, so I don't want to make it sound like I think this game is without value. If you ignore how parts of the ending try and wrap up all of the nonsense as purely delusions with no greater significance, you can read pretty damn deep into the text and get a lot out of both individual characters and the larger whole of the story, which I think is why this title has had such staying power, and it leads nicely into the end of this video. Is it actually worth playing Sayonara Oshiete now? Or really, first off, why the hell is this game so popular still? Because more than any title I've covered on this channel so far, besides Dokyusei and Kenon, SayoOshi's legacy is vast, particularly in its extremely, amazingly feverish fanbase that's deeply inspired by the game. Some of my favorite examples of this are the Toho fanwork Gymnophides Never Ends, which was inspired by this title and other Denpa games. And there's also a fan of SayoOshi being responsible for getting the Ayo-san series revived by virtue of wanting to know more about Hard. The most obvious call out to give though is definitely Needy Girl Overdose, which took a lot of inspiration from this game. And of course, I have to mention all of the amazing fan art and music that surrounds this. Searching the hashtag for the game on Twitter or Pixiv pulls up a wealth of brilliant inventive works, ranging from gorgeous artwork, like the piece on screen from my friend Len, all the way to whole comics where people ship their OCs with Hitomi. It's peak Yume Joshi, and I'm all here for that. I think it's also very interesting that, at least according to the creator of Needy Girl Overdose, a lot of the fans of this game are women, and I can speak anecdotally that most of the people I know who obsess over this are at least some kind of gay. And while that might seem a bit odd on the surface, I think there's actually a lot of precedent for this. People like horror, and what people like even more is horror that they feel resonates with them. Horror that understands what we fear the most and relays it back to us, makes us feel understood. And a title that covers as much ground as this, as brutally and indulgently as this, while mostly not telling the player what to think or feel, is ripe for theorizing and losing yourself in. Speaking as a trans person particularly, I love this aspect of the game, and knowing that I can make any wild reading of it, vibe with it however I do, without having to stop for a moment to think about how some other aspect of the game or some authoritative statement by the author invalidates it, is freeing. Precisely because there is so little meaning to the story of this game, disregarding the ending that perhaps even the authors didn't think deeply about, it's whatever you make of it. It's edoguro nonsense, it's brutal and cruel and uncomfortable, and there's something fascinating about that when done right. That said, however, this is still a brutal and cruel and uncomfortable game, with a mess of an ending, a repetitive and frustrating game system, and content so brutal that simply the trigger warning for it alone is infamous. Which takes us back to the question I briefly blew off. Is SayoOshi worth playing and spending 10 hours or so experiencing? And my answer is maybe? To me, despite all of its flaws, SayoOshi is a thoroughly interesting and resonant title in ways that you aren't going to find anywhere else. It's a reflection of our darkest thoughts, feelings, and desires, a hopeless and bleak story that seems devoid of any sort of bright and happy message. It is in no way a happy game, and I wouldn't say it ever really invokes a sense of catharsis. It's also a damn challenging read. Even ignoring the more blatantly grotesque parts like the Edo and Guro scenes, the story revels in being as unorthodox and bizarre as it can be, lacking character development, clear story progression beyond Hitomi losing more and more of his sanity, and brief moments of prose that feel almost purpose-built to be antagonistic to the player. But it's precisely because of those things that SayoOshi is fascinating. It's shameless in its brutality and darkness, reflecting some of the darkest feelings people can experience back at them. The misery of feeling like life is meaningless, the horror of your own capacity for cruelty, and a desire for catharsis through pain that many experience are on full display here in a way that's as hard to stomach as it is engrossing. Getting your hands on a playable copy these days isn't too hard, at least if you know Japanese. With original copies being prohibitively expensive as well as running on a jinky-ass old engine, you'll probably just want to snag a Windows 10 compatible copy on DL site for 3,000 yen. Though you will need some way to get around the extremely aggressive region locking. RLSC Loader was my tool of choice for both this and for release. Just point it to the executable in the game data folder and you'll be on your merry way. If you're a Japanese learner, then you'll probably be happy to know this game isn't especially dense in terms of vocabulary and grammar. That doesn't mean saying it's an easy read though, for all the reasons I just outlined a moment ago, but with exception to the couple walls of unhinged text, there shouldn't be all that much incomprehensible to an intermediate or greater learner. The challenge comes in making sense of the game thematically, as well as accepting that you aren't going to be given everything you need to know to make sense of things. If you don't know Japanese though, then I'm sorry to say, but you're probably out of luck. There's been no official English release, and the only unofficial translation that ever got completed is infamously of low quality, with countless errors and prose that does not match up to the style of the original text. Maybe it's worth it if you're really desperate to read this, but I cannot in good faith recommend it. Similarly, though for different reasons, it's hard for me to advise just anyone to play SayoOshi. Even fans of horror titles should heed at least a little bit of caution. But if it is something you can stomach, and it's something you think you're in the right state of mind for, it's worth thinking about giving it a read and letting your mind wander if you decide to go through. Let the game lead you where it does, and take the emotions as they come, because I guarantee you won't experience anything like it again. For better, and for worse.